Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round, bookworms, because the time has come for another episode of Rock and Read. I can't wait to dive into a new book called My Effin Life by Rush's remarkable bassist, Geddy Lee. Chapter 1 is called Stamps. Let's check it out. You may naturally assume that I grew up in a house rich in music, that my desire to play must have grown out of musical influences all around me. But music was in little evidence in my childhood home. The radio was always on in the car, but I don't recall Dad ever speaking about music or mentioning any artist he liked or even humming along as we drove. I just thought music didn't register with him. It wasn't until many years after his death, when I was playing a show in Detroit and reconnected with the family of his only surviving brother Sam, living in the suburbs of the Motor City, that my Aunt Charlotte let slip some startling information. "It's so nice that you have become a musician," she said casually. "After all, so was your father." As my brain reeled, she continued, "Oh yes, back in the old country, he played the balalaika, I think. Parties, bar mitzvahs, weddings, and so on." All I could muster was a, "Really?" It seemed so out of character with the man I thought I had known, that I wasn't ready to believe what she was saying. Was he really a player? If so, music must have thrilled him in his early life. And oh man, what questions I would have loved to ask him. But foremost in my mind was why my mother had never mentioned it. Seeing as I was a professional musician by that time, you'd think it would have been a pretty vital tidbit to share with me, no? I was more perplexed than angry, and immediately after getting home from that leg of the tour, I asked her to verify the story and give me an explanation. Visibly embarrassed, she proceeded to relate this to me. For a while after their liberation, my parents lived in Germany at the displaced persons camp at Bergen-Belsen, formerly the officers' quarters of the concentration camp where my mom, her mother, and her sister had been incarcerated for the final months of the Second World War. Obviously, this is a much bigger story, and one that I will be telling you. Then they moved into an apartment in a nearby town, trying to put their lives back together, as so many survivors were, and finally committing to immigrating to Canada. As they were ready for departure, my dad declared that he was packing his balalaika, but my mom refused to allow him to "schlep that fiddle" across the ocean with them. She regarded the instruments as superfluous. His musical endeavors and indulgence they could ill afford as they forged a new life in a new land. This, she now told me, was a decision she had long regretted. It was a heartfelt and meaningful confession, and for me, a revelation as to my own inherent musical aptitude. I guess I came by it, honestly. It's in my genes. Yet sadly, it also goes a long way to explain my father's silence on all things musical and so many other joys of life. Looking back all those years later, I had to wonder if I had missed any signs of his musical soul. Perhaps the decision to buy a piano so my sister Susie could take lessons was his way of planting a musical seed, and as such, connecting with his buried past. But I will never know. I was 6 or so when my parents bought that piano, primarily for Susie, who was 2 years older than me. Apparently, they thought this was what well-raised Canadian school children did. A piano teacher was hired, and as Susie did battle with the keyboard, I'd quietly listen to the lesson from the next room or hiding under the table. She came to play well enough to participate in a school recital, but didn't stick with it. After I had enjoyed some success in music by contrast, my mom liked to relate how, once the teacher had left, I would hop on the piano stool and by ear pick out the melody Susie had been learning, perfectly, as she insisted. Like any big fish tale, this story was most definitely enhanced over time. I do recall tinkling the ivories after Susie's lessons, but I can assure you, I was no Glenn Gould. In the earliest memory I have of my father, the 3-year-old me is at the picture window of our Shaw Street home in downtown Toronto, waiting for him to return from work. The winter light of day is fading into dusk, always a melancholy time for me, even now, and I can hear the tinny fanfare of the Mickey Mouse Club on television in the background. I watch him coming down our street from the streetcar stop at the corner, up the walkway and into the house, with a tight smile and a weary, "Ich bin schon heim. I'm home already." He brushes by me on his way to the kitchen, goes straight to a high-up cupboard, and takes out a bottle of Canadian Club rye whiskey. He pours himself a snort, knocks it back, then smacks his lips, and makes a sound I always remember with a smile of my own. Ah! It was only after he'd had his snaps that he felt rid of the day's grime and could pick me up and give me a kiss, playfully scratching my face with his 5 o'clock stubble. I can smell the liquor on his breath as I type these words. Then he puts me down and goes on to do the same to Susie, and finally hugs and kisses our mom. This handsome man with dark European looks came to Canada in 1948 with the proverbial $10 in his pocket and the love of his life on his arm. Moish and Manya stepped foot on their new homeland as Morris and Mary, angelicized persona for an angelicized world, seeking a fresh start in a dominion unscarred by war and genocide. Morris already had family here, a sister Rose, who had left Poland for Toronto before the war. For someone who had lost both of his parents, 5 siblings, and countless other family members, all murdered by the Nazis, reuniting with her was the urgent and natural thing to do. Soon after their arrival, the remainder of my mother's family chose to join her and Morris in their great Canadian adventure. Her sister Ida, brother Harold, and their spouses, but most important, her mother, another Rose, and the heroine of the Rubenstein tribe, as I will show you in time. My dad was a loving father, but strict. He had an explosive temper, but it took a lot to trigger it. I pause here because it seems unfair to mention any of the few bad moments of my short life with him. Unfair because the fact that he survived the war, the fact that he had made it to the blessed shores of Canada at all, is a miracle. Suffice it to say that I was pretty accomplished at provoking him, and as with most parents of his generation, if any of us kids did something really wrong, well, we'd get a whooping. We knew that he and Mom cared deeply for each other. They argued sometimes, but hey, that was life in a Jewish home. What seems like shouting to Gentiles, or white people as we sometimes referred to them, was just regular conversation around our dinner table. When the whole family got together for the high holidays, my God, it was a shouting match. But the love my parents had for each other won out over any argument, and they were demonstrative about it. I remember when I was about 8 years old, Dad must have been feeling amorous. We were watching TV when he surreptitiously raised his arms above his head to get my mom's attention and made a scratching motion with one hand in the opposite palm. I didn't know what that meant until the kids at school told me it was a signal for... Wow, really? Ew. Both our parents worked hard. Motivated to build a new life and raise a family, they held down factory jobs on Spadina Avenue, the hub of Toronto's smacked industry, which, like many greenhorns when they first landed, they referred to simply as on Spadina. Once my mom had Susie, and me 2 years later. She stopped work, and it was up to my dad to hustle a living and pay the bills. It helped that they also received reparations from the German government. But we were a decidedly working-class family, without much spare cash or time for the pursuit of frivolous hobbies like music. With no money for hotels or fancy holidays, We did like many immigrants still do in Toronto. On Sundays, we picnicked with my family and cousins on Toronto Island or in Hyde Park. The men would sit on a blanket playing cards and laughing, and I could always hear my dad's voice louder than the others. They drank Red Cap Ale and Carling Black Label. If you're a Canadian, you'll remember those stubby little bottles. I remember sneaking away once to taste a Black Label, but to me at that age, it was just god-awful. At one point, Dad was hired by a distant cousin to work in his shoddy mill. He rose in the ranks to a position of some authority, but one day came home ranting that he had been treated unfairly by his own cousin, and in a rage had quit his job. It didn't take him long to bounce back, though. He found a partner and proudly started a business of his own, Lakeview Felt. I remember going there with him and wandering around the wide boarded floors in awe of the machines and the odors of wood and oil. But that too came crashing down when at the first sign of struggle, the partner panicked and made a quick deal behind his back with his former boss. After that betrayal, Dad was unemployed for a lengthy period. I remember him being around the house and down in the dumps while he looked for opportunities. Then he decided he no longer wanted to worry about partners or factory life at all, and started looking for a small retail business instead. He eventually found a little variety store called Times Square Discount in the burgeoning town of Newmarket, Ontario. That was a pretty bold move on his part, since he had never worked in retail before, but he ran it well. The locals liked him a lot, and there was even an article in the local newspaper reporting on him as a boon to the community. After the war and throughout my childhood, Toronto's immigrant population was bent on moving north. My mother used to say the Jews were the first, and when they went even further out, the Italians would move in and so on, like hand-me-down neighborhoods. It was an exodus from Toronto's crowded, grimy downtown, where they had little choice but to live and work when they'd first arrived. The charm of a home with older bones was lost on them. This was the new world, after all. They wanted a new world house with a new kitchen, a two-car garage with a backyard and space between the houses on either side, as different as they could get from the crowded, battered buildings they had left behind in Europe. Our first house had been a rental on Crawford Street in what's now known as Little Portugal, which is where my sister Susie was born. When I came along, we moved to another, one block over, on Shaw Street. By the time I was 5, they had scraped enough money together to actually buy a house, and that investment took them north to 53 Vincy Crescent, a small bungalow in the North Toronto suburb of Downsview. Situated on the Crescent, we were blessed with a large triangular slice of property and a rare bower of plum and apple and cherry trees in the backyard, a blissful Garden of Eden that transcended our humdrum location. I'd play there with my friends, and toward the end of summer, pick off the ripest fruit. The blackberries were pretty sweet, though the plums were never as ready to pluck as my parents insisted they were. Maybe it was wishful thinking on their part, but most likely they were relishing the fact that after all they had survived during the war, here they were now in their own home, growing their own fruit, which, ripe or not, tasted of, well, freedom. And to this day, I too have a taste for plums that are a little hard and tart. Fruit trees aside, what were those suburbs like? In a word, bland. In 2 words, mind-numbingly bland. The architecture was unimaginative and repetitive, practically but not aesthetically built, with garages jutting out in front of the houses. The inescapable message being that cars were more important than the people who lived there. The neighborhoods were virtually treeless, the backyards big but mostly empty except for the occasional swing set, with metal or wooden fences so low you could stick your nose into your neighbor's business. Ironically, many years later when my son Julian was the same age and we'd take him to the suburbs to visit my mom, he never wanted to leave. He'd ask, "How come we can't live in the suburbs like Bubba does? It's so clean and beautiful." Yikes! One child's ceiling is another one's floor, I guess. To my parents, of course, the burbs must have seemed like heaven. A safe place where their kids were free to play in the streets or ride up on their bikes pretty much anywhere. But the reality was that having survived the war, they had other things on their mind, like building a new life. Today, every minute of a child's day is monitored, but in those days, there was neither the time nor the inclination for helicoptering. As children themselves under bombardment, they'd have routinely been sent on hazardous missions such as dashing out for loaves of bread. Now they'd look up from their workbenches only if they had heard we'd gotten into serious trouble, and they didn't know the half of what we got up to. I remember one time we rode our bikes over to my new school, when we saw some older boys climbing up a drain pipe to retrieve a load of tennis balls that other kids had lost up there. We climbed up after them, or at least I did, for when I looked around, I realized my pals had decided against it and split. I scrambled about the rooftop and collected as many balls as I could, while they shimmied back down. Only then did I fully realize how high up I was, how much scarier it would be to descend than it had been to climb. I tried to slide down a drain pipe, but slipped and landed flat on my back with the wind knocked right out of me, gasping up at the vast blue dome of suburban sky. Eventually limped home with my bike and my swag, snuck past my mom who was preparing dinner, and got into the tub to soak my aching body. I was sore for days. Did anyone notice? Nope. But hey, that was a kid's life back then. At Faywood Public School, I was something of a loner, a quiet kid who rarely got into trouble. I did my schoolwork in the usual, unnoticeable, and less than stellar manner, with no particular passion for any particular subject. My report cards consistently featured comments to the effect of, "If he would only apply himself, he could do very well," or, "Gary has a tendency to daydream in class." I remember thinking, what does apply himself even mean? I was a classic underachiever, neither bad enough to fail, nor good enough to excel. It's a common mistake to assume that when a kid, or an adult for that matter, is quiet, he must be some sort of deep thinker. In my case, I'm afraid it was simply that I didn't have much to say. Not all still waters run deep. In grade 5, I sang in the school choir. That was one thing I can say I really did enjoy. It will come as no surprise to you that I was a soprano. I attended practices for the Leonard Bernstein musical on the town as an alternate, meaning I'd only get to perform if someone fell ill. The night of the play, I was sort of dopily wandering around the school, looking for where the alternates got to hang out, and must have looked lost. A teacher I had previously seen in the schoolyard, and pegged for someone pretty mean, came up to me and asked what I was up to. I shrugged, kind of pathetically. He said, "Follow me," and took me up to a little room where the spotlights were operated. "How would you like to help out?" he said, and for the 2-night run, I swung those big, scorching lights to and fro across the stage. It was a total magic up there, way more fun than singing in the choir. To see the production from that perspective was surreal, and I loved being part of the crew. My first taste of show business, thanks to a kind man who made me feel useful and valued. Thank you, Mr. Geddy. Oh, before I continue, here's a piece of trivia from my public school days. There was a boy in my class named Rick Moranis. Yes, the Rick Moranis of Ghostbusters and Little Shop of Horrors fame. We weren't close friends or anything, but we're in the same class every year from kindergarten right through to grade 6. In 1981, by which time he had become successful as one of the McKenzie brothers in the Great White North sketches on SCTV, he asked me to sing the lead on a song called Take Off for their comedy album, The Great White North. That would be my first entry into the top 20 and the biggest hit single of my career. Around grade 4 or 5, nerd that I was, I started collecting stamps. My starter collection was a beat-up old album my father gave me. For years, I was under the impression that it had been his own, but I don't remember him ever showing any interest in philatelistry, And knowing what I know now about his life in the aftermath of the war in Europe, I suspect that he either acquired it on the black market there, or most likely it had been given to him in Canada and he passed it on to me. Anyway, there was a kid in my class I'd go to hobby shops with whenever I could afford it to buy stamps from far-off countries. While Canadian stamps looked dull to me, featuring nothing but variations on Queen Elizabeth's profile, I was transported by colorful designs from mysterious and exotic sources like Republic de Togo and Magyar Posta. I embrace stamps as a way of seeing the world from my bedroom or my desk during exceptionally boring math classes. And considering my obsessive, almost addictive nature, I think of them now as a gateway drug of sorts. Those stamps were, you could say, my first art collection. Just before I started grade 6 in the spring of 1964, Mom and Dad, with 3 young kids under their roof now, my brother Alan was born in 1960, and facing a daily hour-long commute, decided to look for somewhere to live closer to the store. We searched even farther north, to the very edge of the city, and found a brand spanking new house on Torresdale Avenue in the brand spanking new suburb of Willowdale, which was even more suburban than Downsview, newer but starker and soulless. Viewed from above, you would have seen a town planner's map of some ideal future suburb, the trees mere saplings, with houses like some Lego construction and little plastic people on the grid-like streets. It was the very edge of town, like in Pete Seeger's song Little Boxes, where they all get put into boxes and they all come out the same. All we'd do as teens was dream of moving downtown where everything was happening, where the hippies were, where the musicians hung out. The further you got from the epicenter of cool, the less cool you felt, and where we were, you couldn't be more disconnected from cool. The mention of Willowdale and the River Dawn in the Necromancer, the song Rush would one day write for Caress of Steel, was a jokey reference to that bland suburbia we were all trying to get away from. Pleasantsville, if you like. And 8 years later, with subdivisions, we were trying to express more seriously the same dead-end feelings of isolation and almost painful yearning. Apparently, that song rang true for a lot of people, including guys like the documentary filmmaker Michael Moore, who said he believes it has actually saved lives. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it has definitely resonated powerfully with a great many individuals who, listening to it in their identical housing units on the great suburban matrix, at least realized they were not so alone. Willowdale was more a title in a mosaic than the idealized Canadian melting pot of cultural influences. I hesitate to use the word ghetto, considering the real ghetto conditions my parents barely survived in Poland, but our neighborhood was made up mainly of Jewish families, across the tracks from the older farm community beyond the city limits, the main east-west thoroughfare of Steeles Avenue. Not all those folks were pleased to see a burgeoning Jewish community on their patch. Anti-Semitism was still rife in those days, handed down to a fresh new generation of hate-mongering teenagers. The farm boys and other locals were on the lookout for young ethnics like me to terrorize. I was a particularly easy target, shy to begin with and self-conscious about my outstanding nose. I had already been razzed about it from time to time, but the abuse was worse now, and growing my hair long, as I started to at around age 12 and my earliest emulation of my rock and roll heroes, further stoked the ire of those goons. The neighborhood was too new to have a junior high, so we were bused to the nearest one, R.J. Lang Elementary and Middle School, about a 15-minute drive away. On arrival every day, we Jews from Bathurst Village had to briskly walk the gauntlet across the yard to the main entrance. If you broke into an actual run, you were asking to be chased. Sometimes the waiting kids would stand there unnervingly silent, watching our every move. Other times they taunted us, pushing and shoving until fights broke out, even between the girls. Not exactly the way the world looks at us nice, polite Canadians, eh? I wouldn't rush to call it anti-Semitism, necessarily. More than anything, it was a territorial war. Those jerks trolling the streets and hallways for Jews to torment beat on anyone who didn't fit into their worldview. They really weren't all that discerning. But come to think of it, as the chosen people, we did get singled out for special treatment. Okay, yeah, I've changed my mind. It was anti-Semitism. One time in the hallway, as I was bending over to retrieve something from my locker, I was shoved from behind and rammed right into it, with my head and ears stuck inside, and humiliatingly had to be held back to my feet. Another time after school, I was standing with a friend at a bus stop, smoking a cigarette. Yeah, lots of us smoked at 12 back then. If you could puff on an Export A without coughing your head off, which I could not, you were a real man. And when I threw the finished butt away, a couple of farm boys strode up and pushed me hard, and one menacingly said, "Hey, I didn't like the way you threw that away." Okay, sorry, I said, holding my breath until they had walked away. I escaped a beating that time, but on it went. More often than not, we'd be greeted when we got home by knuckleheads waiting on their bikes at the bus stop to harass us, whooping and hollering all the way to our doorsteps. We learned to run pretty fast, I can tell you. We never told our parents, partly because we didn't want to admit our fear, even to ourselves, but we also knew that our experience couldn't compare to what they had been through during the war. Even now, they had enough to worry about, and we didn't want them to see us as the weak and frightened students we really were. The consequence, however, was that nothing was ever done to protect us. In those days, I was a big fan of DC Comics, especially Superman and Green Lantern. And I remember wishing, if only I had the power to become invisible, then I could walk amongst these holes without being so afraid. Working-class immigrants like our parents were hard-pressed to simply put food on our plates. We kids knew no different, and for the most part, didn't care. But there were times when it stung. Not knowing how to skate, for instance, was an instantly alienating offense for a Canadian boy, and certainly didn't help me to assimilate. I was bought a pair of skates, but was otherwise left to learn on my own, and spent many a freezing cold Sunday afternoon shaking off frozen fingers and toes as I dragged myself around the ice on my ankles. Needless to say, I would never be anyone's first pick for games of shinny, if I made the cut at all. Baseball, meanwhile, was in my bones, long before music started to seriously divert my attention. There were no Major League Toronto teams then, but on weekends, I'd watch the New York Yankees on TV, beamed in from stations in Buffalo, with stars like Mickey Mantle, Whitney Ford, Yogi Berra, and Roger Maris, as well as their rivals, the Detroit Tigers, of whom I was a big fan. And I remember hopping on the bus in streetcar with my pals for the trip downtown to watch the Maple Leafs, Toronto's AAA International League team. I must have been just 10 or 11, and can't recall the presence of an adult with us at all, so those memories feel like my earliest independent moments. Maple Leaf Stadium at the south end of Bathurst Street near the lake shore was a typical minor league ballpark of that period, with high bleachers, metal box seats, and wooden benches wrapping around from foul pole to foul pole and behind the infield. In truth, by the time I was old enough to go, it had become dingy and run down, and the games were sparsely attended. It was demolished not long afterward. In 1968, after the team had left town to play as an unaffiliated club, grooming players for various major league clubs. Nonetheless, photos of the old ball yard, with banner ads along its wall at the back like "Read the Star First for Sports," "Export and Stoney's Bread Company," sparked nostalgia in me. Those balmy days were among the happiest of my childhood. I spent countless hours on our driveway pretending to be a pitcher, throwing a rubber ball as hard as I could against the wall of our house. I'd say to myself, I can throw harder, yeah, with the feeling that I always had a faster throw in me, even if I didn't. When I was 11, I summoned the nerve to try out for my neighborhood baseball team, but I didn't make it and was crushed. Licking my wounds, I played out the rest of my sports career in the school playground. much of that time bent over baseball cards, of which we were fervent collectors. We considered them precious, but flung them around in a game called closies, competing to get closest to the schoolyard wall, and leansies, where you lean one card against the wall and take turns trying to knock it down with a well-judged flip of another, creasing the corners in the process. Oh my God! How it hurts to think that today those cards in perfect condition could be worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. My dad wasn't much of a baseball fan, but I do remember watching Hockey Night in Canada with him. Not too often, for it would be past my bedtime. I'd sneak out of my room and crawl under the furniture to watch without him knowing, or at least that's what I thought, until he'd calmly say, "Gary, go to bed now." Busted. But my favorite memory of him in sports was watching the wrestling. OMG, he would get so excited. Seaman Art Thomas, Sweet Daddy Sicky, Haystacks Calhoun, Lord Othel-Waden, and he loved the stick. I don't think he cared whether it was real or fake at all. He was so into it that he'd mimic the wrestlers' holds, so much that one time he wrestled himself right off the couch and bang onto the floor. Summers were lazy and hazy. My siblings and me hanging out on the streets with all the other unsupervised kids. On Saturdays, from breakfast to lunch, I'd be rooted to the carpet in front of our Fox wood-paneled RCA Victor, mesmerized by the Bowery Boys, then the Three Stooges, and rounding out the morning with an array of horse operas featuring those singing cowboys, Roy Rogers and Gene Autry, or more authentic westerns starring John Wayne or Randolph Scott. Dang, I love them all. Still do. Basically, I was left alone to watch as much TV as I wanted. But TV wasn't only for goofing off. It brought the world into our living room on Vinci Crescent, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the assassination of presidents, to on February 9, 1964, the Beatles on their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. And suddenly, there was my sister kneeling on the floor in front of the television, crying and reaching for the TV screen, as if she might touch the Fab Four and have one of them all to herself. I remember laughing to myself and thinking, what is wrong with her? But seeing the impact that rock and roll had on her made a definite impression on me. Needless to say, our parents were singularly unimpressed, but rock and roll music had entered our home, and as my mom would say, the rest is history. Little by little, this nerdy Jewish kid with immigrant parents was assimilating, blending in and meeting new friends as best I could, going to new schools and hearing about new bands on an almost daily basis. North York may not have been the beating heart of the swinging 60s, but we sure wanted to be a part of it. We were buying records now. The British invasion had begun. Not just the Beatles, but the Kinks, the Stones, and Donovan, and our young minds were opening up to fresh ideas about clothes and style. I grew my hair longer, letting the bangs drop over my forehead to cover my eyes. Then on the night of October 8th, 1965, my father died in his sleep, and the music stopped cold. He had come down with the flu. He was supposed to stay home with me, as I had it too, but while Mom was ready for work, he heard his carpool buddies honk the horn outside, grabbed his jacket, and ran out to jump in with them. Mom was furious, because she was then forced to take the bus to the store in Newmarket, and when she got there, gave him an earful and sent him home. I remember being in bed, semi-delirious with the fever, and hearing him return. I remember him asking me how I was. And I remember him heading off to his bedroom. That was the last time I saw him alive. I awoke to screams. Struggling to rub the sleep from my eyes, I saw Mom in her nightclothes crying hysterically, then running out into the street, yelling for help. Pandemonium. Soon our neighbors filled the house. The police were called. Firemen were stomping indoors and stomping heavily on the steps. My sister and I sat side by side in silence on the edge of our parents' bed, staring, stunned beyond comprehension, at Dad's lifeless body, there where he ordinarily slept. A chilling sight I shall never, ever forget. In time, we were hustled out of the room, and I was put back to bed, still feverish, while Susie was taken to a neighbor's house for the duration of the madness. I don't even know where my little brother was or who was taking care of him, but I imagine it was my grandmother or mom's sister, Aunt Ida. I fell into a fever dream. Some hours later, I was roused from sleep by my uncles and told to get dressed. Everything was still manic. People were arguing. He should put on a suit. No, look at him. Du kind caught a fever. But he needs to look nice. It's his father's funeral. This went on all the way down the steps to the black sedan waiting at the front door. In the back seat on the way to the cemetery, I was lost in a world of my own. When we arrived at the gravesite, I was told to wait in the car. It was dusk and raining. I looked through the window at the huddle of mourners around my father's open grave. Women sobbing and comforting one another, a cohort of men in dark coats led by the rabbi, all shuckling, swaying on the spot as they prayed. Then two men, maybe my uncles, started arguing again as they opened the car door. He should come out and say the Kaddish. No, the child is sick and it's raining. It'll be forgiven if he doesn't say it. Someone slammed the door back shut and told the driver to take me home. I looked back through the black rain as that terrible, somber crowd faded from view. Morris Weinrib passed away at the age of 45. I was 12. Outwardly, he had survived the horrors of the Holocaust, seemingly unscathed, but his heart was damaged by 6 years of slave labor in the camps. I believe he had suffered not just physically, but spiritually too, by which I really mean that he lost his religiosity, if he had any in the first place. After the experience of the camps, he only put that on for my mother's sake. But you know, here I'm just guessing, because he never shared such thoughts with me. He never told me what was in his heart. He never told me about his anger toward the German people or the Nazis or any of that. He never talked about the war at all, not that I remember. He was always more reticent about the war than my mom was, and about pretty much everything else, too. I do, however, have one concrete reason to believe that he had only been pretend religious. When I was about 10, I accompanied him and Mom to Eden's and Simpson's, two big department stores across from each other at Yonge and Queen in downtown Toronto. As Mom pulled us toward the women's wear department, Dad said he'd go for a coffee and a smoke instead. He smoked Export A. I remember distinctly because I thought their green package with the Scots glass in her tasseled tam was cool. Bored stiff, hanging around with Mom, I slipped away after him. But when I got to the lower-level cafeteria, I had to stop short on the stairs. There he was at the table on his own with his coffee and cigarette, eating bacon and eggs. My eyes nearly popped out of my head. My own dad eating trafe. Then as I watched him from afar, a sly grin spread across my face. Not only did I love the fact that I had busted him, but a heretical idea was planted in my brain that all these religious rules were bull. It was like getting a hall pass, a get-out-of-jail-free card, and I knew that one day I was going to use it. In the end, how I imagine him is assembled from just a smattering of observation, my own and those of others, quiet until spoken to, more physical than verbal, except at parties, when he was the life of the party, always the jokester. Everyone in our resettled family adored him. I have photos of him at parties in which you can see he's wasted. His eyes are a little less bright than everyone else's. So I suspect he enjoyed a drink or two. He'd kid with the other children as much with me. He'd think nothing of slinging my cousin Gary up on his shoulders and horsing around with him. If somebody farted, or if he farted, he would turn to us and go, "Did you see it?" He could be hard-headed. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him. But he was funny, upbeat, hard-working, proud, fully filling the shoes of the New World man. He was able to push aside whatever demons walked around with him. Maybe he wanted to live a good and happy life, but was simply mugged by a bad heart, a condition that would be fixed today, just like that. These are the memories I have of him, the slideshow in my head. Among the last snapshots, clear as day, is one from when I was 11 or 12, him standing on the porch of our house in Torresdale, giving me a serious look. I had my bike with me and was chit-chatting with a couple of girls. He called me over and said bluntly, "Don't talk to girls, you're too young." Now, although I did have a bit of a crush on one who lived down the street, I was just a little smeekle. I had no idea what I was doing. So I guess he saw a twinkle in my young eyes and felt compelled to give me some fatherly advice and a wag of the finger. But soon he was gone, and that was the full extent of the birds and the bees that I ever got from him. My mother never, ever went there, so like most kids of my generation, that was something I'd have to figure out for myself. In the end, while I can still picture his expressions both funny and stern, I'm sorry to say that I can barely remember a single conversation we shared. There wasn't a lot of time to have one. Well, that's the end of the first chapter. Let me know what you thought of chapter 1 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.